Yeah,
Please.
okay, so my name is Olaf Blaauw, and I've been basically thinking about circularity, circular economy, and sustainability for quite some time now, meaning most part of my life. And only over the past 5 to 10 years have the types of ideas that I've been pondering about come to fruition in the proper world. Our economy is collapsing, although we may not see it. I'll get to that in the talk. So we need something which is better than we're currently doing. And I happen to have some ideas that fit into that plan to make things better, rather than just less bad. I've been working within the construction industry as well, with the Delta Development Group, for whom I am a strategic consultant, on how to lay the foundations from which to build something which is actually sustainable. One of the most notable things that Delta has done is Park 2020. I'll get to that in the presentation as well, which is an example of how you actually don't just think about circularity or cradle to cradle or the donut economy, but actually implement it. Because we can all agree that we can all agree on what's wrong today. We can also all agree on how the future might look. But the most important thing is not so much that why or that what, but the how. How do we get there? And implementation is something that I'd like to discuss with you today. It's also true that I have only 40 minutes, and I'll be fast-paced through this. So I apologize if it's a lot of information in a short time, but you can always ask me questions later. So I think that's good. But in the interest of time, I think it's not as important to talk about me, but talk about the ideas that I, amongst other people, represent, which is how can we get from system thinking to system doing? I mean, how do we, as I say, how do we reestablish our concept of value in a changing economy? So, the agenda for today, first I'll give you an introduction to system thinking. What is my definition of it? How do I handle these topics from my personal point of view? And what actually might make some sense to you? And I'll use some basic examples to get some very sort of abstract thoughts into very pragmatic formats. Then we'll talk about what's about circularity and what's about circular economy, because circularity is one thing, but a circular economy is an economy which relies on circularity. They're not the same things, and I'll try to make that sure, to get that thought across with you. Then I'd like us to value, as in let's reestablish what we consider to be of value. Currently, we think of costs, we think of scarcity, we don't think of the creation of value as being the source of economic development rather than economic growth. And then practice makes perfect. I'll give you the example of Park 2020, but also how we can actually use the principles of circular economy thinking today within our current framework and still come up with a better solution than the standard linear practice without actually having to wait for the system to change as a whole, which I think is important because we need to start yesterday. As I often say to people, it's not 2 minutes to midnight, it's 4:30 in the morning. And we need to realize that very thoroughly. So, without further ado, this is a slide I always show in all my talks. This is basically a very pretty picture of a group of skydivers all trying to get a perfect geometric pattern. Because this is that picture. And it illustrates our current system collapse. What we are doing is we're trying to optimize what we're doing right now. We try to be less polluting, not as much carbon dioxide, not as much single-use plastics, etc., etc. But we're optimizing the way we do our things currently. The problem is, however, as we're optimizing and altering our organizational patterns, the ground is fast approaching. So we're not doing anything to actually stop us from crashing into the soil. So the system must change. And once you get this, it's easy to follow the rest of the story. So I'll give you an introduction to systems thinking. I'll start with a very simple example from nature. This is a termite mound. And this is not the best example because actually a termite mound is oriented in a north to south orientation. And you can all figure out why that is. It has to do with cooling. Now, which termites design or manage the mound? Who of us is responsible for managing our economic system? It's the same question. Well, the answer is none of them. None of the termites is responsible for the design and the management of the termite mound, although they build it, they live in it, etc. Then who or what does? Well, like any system, the mound is governed by laws. In this case, the law of natural selection. And it identifies deciding factors. So what is the most important thing that guides the construction of the termite mound? Well, it's these two things, amongst others. On the left, you see a pangolin, which has very sharp claws and forces the mound to be very hard in nature. On the right, you see the fact that the Earth rotates. The Earth rotates, so the sun appears to move across the sky, so any termite mound which is not oriented in the north to south direction has less chance of producing viable offspring than one, if it's east to west, it doesn't work. The cooling doesn't work, etc. So you may try to build a different system, but the laws that govern it will not change. So you have to work within the constraints of your system. That's the single point I'm trying to make here. So what decides for us? Well, in our money-driven economy, there's also a law, which means that if something is profitable, it survives. If something is loss-giving, it does not survive. It's as simple as that. So anything we do has to do with, does it produce more value than it takes away from the system? Because if that's the case, we have a winner. If that's not the case, we have a loser. Think about that when we talk about sustainability thinking. Adding costs to processes to mitigate the negative effects of us trying to build that perfect geometric pattern of skydivers. We're not adding value, so we're only adding costs. And then we want to reduce them, we start thinking efficiency, etc. So businesses are the current instruments of system change, because there is a way that if we look at how we judge our profitability, this decides on how we actually perform in the system transition. There is, however, one problem. Now, let's go back to systems on a more abstract level. A system behavior cannot be derived from its constituent parts. Now, this is a snapshot I took 3.8 billion years ago on a beautiful tropical beach. And as you can see, life had not evolved yet. And you see pristine elements. There's carbon, there's sulfur, there's oxygen, there's all these things that make up our reality. But they are organized in fairly simple patterns. Now, last week I went to the exact same spot and I took this picture. And as you can see, a lot of things have changed. What has changed is not the amount of stuff that you see in this picture. It's the same amount of molecules. It's the same, not molecules, but the same amount of elements. But the way life has organized them over the course of 3.8 million years is rather different. You see, what is added is not more of anything, it's just complexity. Things are being done in a more complex and maybe even a better way. There's no way you can take a carbon atom 3.8 billion years ago and tell from it that a clownfish will one day reside in a sea anemone. Because that is historical unicity. That is what happens over the course of time. That is what can be seen from a system level looking down. But if you look at constituent parts of systems, such as us, such as companies, even cities, we cannot describe the system behavior from the bottom up. We can only describe the behavior of constituents from the top down. So, constituent parts of any system are subject to laws that decide what can happen and what cannot happen, and historical unicity that decides what actually happens. So I'm not sure whether you're familiar with microscopy, but this on the right here you see these are actually individual atoms, and they are, as you can see, they align in geometric patterns like our collapsing system does to some extent. But you see some gaps here as well. So you know that if you put all these atoms together, they will form this pattern. But you cannot tell, looking at one single atom, where it will end up in the system. Now this is an important basic truth that we all need to understand when we look at system change. So where does that change occur? Does it occur in our instruments, in our businesses? Does it occur in our lawgivers, in our countries, in our nation governments? Or does it occur somewhere else? Because system complexity may just appear to be too much. So how can you make sense of it if you can barely derive anything from looking at a constituent part of a system? So let's become practical. Now, transformation of any system into the next relies on implementation. You need to do stuff. And what do we need to do and where do we need to do it? Well, the interesting thing is, if you take that whole system thinking about laws and constituent parts and behavior, you can have the analogy with our current state of affairs. So we have a system which is guided by laws that happen on the state level usually. We have parts, which are citizens and companies, and then we have behavior. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because if we want to transform our system, the system level that we're actually most well adapted for to make that change happen is the city level. Cities are the one place where we need to integrate what laws tell us can or cannot happen, plus what individual parts, say companies and people, actually need and require. That level of integration forces us to look at what we're doing and how we're doing it. How do we balance all stakeholders' interests? So a city level is, when it comes to the transformation into, say, a circular economy, is where it's most easily adaptable. But it starts with having the little seeds that are the instruments, which is the businesses that should start looking at profitability and value in a different fashion. So cities are most likely platforms for system change. I'm sorry to say this to anyone representing this wonderful Ministry of the Environment, but you can only create the conditions. You cannot actually create the change. So, I'll say it once again, because this is a part that a lot of people, you understand this, I guess, but most governments in the world and most ministers of economic affairs do not. That is that if you wish to have economic development, we think in terms of growth. And this growth is exponential. Yet we have one single problem, which is there is a lot of stuff in this world, there are a lot of consumers, there is a lot of energy, but it's not infinite, it's finite. Our system has boundaries. And any exponential growth will eventually be inhibited in its growth by the systemic boundaries. So to your right, you see that the carrying capacity of any system is the limiting factor. Yet we still wish, although we've passed that point of having diminishing returns, we still wish to continue to grow exponentially. People are still looking at 3% per year as if that were a good thing, which means you double in size every 28 years. It's not a good thing, it's impossible. So if something is not scalable, you cannot do it, yet we choose to do so. And what we do then is incur a debt to our future generations and to those now who need to lose so we may win. Which is the exact reason why you see in the World Economic Forum in Davos every year, there's now 28 people this year who together represented the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of the world's population. That used to be 350 people 5 years ago and 1,500 people 20 years ago. It's getting to a concentration of wealth and power in this world, which is not healthy. The same for companies. There used to be millions of companies that together made up the world economy. I can now give you a list of maybe 1,000 companies that make up 80% of the world's economic traffic. And that is indicating system collapse at a very, very clear scale. So if we cannot grow quantitatively, maybe we may develop qualitatively. That's the main message here. Because most people that think about circular economy think about scarcity. You know, we need to be independent of scarcity of materials. We need to make sure we cycle and recycle all our materials so we may not ever go without them. Because if you look at the maps, you'll find that we have like 10 to 20 to 30 to 40 years of all the things we currently require, including all kinds of rare earth metals and stuff. And they're all in China, and we think that's a bad idea, so we want to become autarkic and have our own energy, our own materials, and cycle them continuously. But that's not really what will save us. You see, circularity is a necessity for sustainability. And that is for the simple reason that if you have a non-regenerative system, it will deplete itself by definition. Who would want that? If I ask any of you, I mean, if you were a room full of students and I'd ask you who of you would like to start a company, I'd see roughly 50 hands go up. If I then would ask who of you would like to start an unsustainable company, those hands would go down. So it's usually a question, it's not so much, shall we try and do something which is regenerative and restorative? It's why do I get out of bed every day and do something which is not? It's a much more important question. So look at nature, where everything is continuously cycled. You have a problem. The good thing is everything gets returned into the system. Nothing goes to waste. There is no waste in nature. But there is a loss of information. There is a loss of functionality. And in our economy, we value functionality over materials. Your mobile phone may be worth 3 or 4 euros of materials, but it's worth 500 to 1,000 euros of functionality. That's why you pay so much money for it. And you see, so the quality of things, on a system level, the behavior and the organization of things is what is the actual value in our economy as well. So circularity allows you to apply an increasingly better design on the same set of building blocks. And that is the real underlying principle of a circular economy, that you can still have development without having growth. So you get decoupled from scarcity. If you do something better, it's worth more. If you do something less well, it's worth less. So the economic law of profitability trumping loss-givingness, you will still end up with a system that favors that which is better and creates more value. It's just you will not longer be taking value away from others and making it your own. In our current zero-sum game, you win, I lose, or I lose, you win, or whatever scenario. Now, these are the basic tenets of whatever you may think of as a circular economy, because we all have our own definition. There's 127, I think, out there right now in literature. I think being restorative and regenerative is an underlier of all these definitions, but having value at its core and cycling the value rather than the materials is the other one. So, we may choose a path towards a future which is sustainable, which is the reason why we're in this room, because we want that. But we wish to find out how to do it. Now, a circular economy is not a recycling economy. It's based on value creation and value retention. If I build an office building and I put steel construct in there, I may weld it or I may screw it. I don't need to explain this, I think, but I'll do it anyway. If I take the building down, the iron which was welded will be worth 25 euros for 150k of material. It's scrap metal. If I had left it as a beam, it would still be worth 250 euros. So which is the value I'd like to return from that system? It's the functional value, not the material value. So all your design efforts go into maintaining functional value rather than just maintaining material value, because you get the material value with it. But you lose the functional value if you don't think about it. And the slight increase in cost of actually building something this way do not weigh up against the incredible loss you get when you lose your functional value at the end of use. So it's a means, not an end, recycling. So the key to circularity is design. But the key to a circular economy is finance. Because that's economy. It means that we use this to build a system in which wealth can be created. Now, for the product design, this is probably old news. I'll go through it quickly. I mean, you design for disassembly, you design for future adaptability, you design for functional value retention, you use sustainable energy sources only, you create closed loops for your water. Nutrient retrieval is essential, but secondary to functionality retrieval, because a circular economy is value-based, not material-based. And no toxins may be used as cycles, that's a given. And you have to design for social fairness. A distribution of wealth which is more evenly disposed than today's situation is preferable. And there are many ways in which you can, if you don't take stuff away from others to make it your own, but you create value to share, that actually gives a more equal distribution of happiness as well, not just wealth. Okay, can you read this? Yeah, because there's lines there, but that's okay. So you have to look at both design and financing. And one important lesson that I think we can all take home from today is that if you use old-fashioned sustainability thinking, it's about being less bad. It's about being eco-efficient. It's having less plastic in the oceans, less carbon dioxide here. But as my friend Bill McDonough often says, if you tell everyone what it is you're not doing, it's like getting into a taxi and saying, "Do not take me to the airport." I don't care what we're not doing. I want to know what we are doing. And so if you add measures to compensate for the bad side effects of your product, you're adding costs, but you're not adding value. Because a car with a catalyst will not drive better or worse than a car without a catalyst. It's more expensive to build. So you need to ask more money for your car, and you can only do so much with regards to mitigating measures before something becomes a loss-giving product, or it's simply not as profitable, which is the reason why current products that are not very good for the environment or not very good for a system still win out in the market on the products that are really good, like biological and organic meats and fruits, because they are more expensive, so we have to pay more. The whole point of a circular economy is not to create things that are circularity, but to ensure that the value we create gets transposed from one use cycle to the next. So the actual costs involved get spread out evenly over multiple use cycles. So per use cycle, your product actually gets less expensive rather than more expensive. And this is how that works. So if you use sustainability thinking and add mitigating measures, your total cost of ownership go up. But I'm not interested in total cost of ownership. I'm interested in total cost of use. What does it cost me to have access to a certain level of functionality? So circularity unlocks the profitability potential by designing residual value and allowing those costs to be spread out over multiple use cycles. So circular financing is not based on total cost of ownership, but on total cost of use. It ideally expresses the ability to have a higher earn-out potential from circular design than from linear design, but it requires exception of validation and accountancy. And another important thing is, what I'll get to now, is that there is time. If I build residual value into something and it only becomes available again in 40 years from now, no accountant will say, well, that's part of your current asset. It's something, well, we cannot make decisions on such a long term, so we might as well not take those circularity measures today, as we see in the built environment. So there are split incentives. Say, well, I mean, when I put up a building and I finance the construction, I am in a high-risk environment. And then when I'm an investor and I take on the building once someone has been found to lease it for 20 years or 30 years, I mean, obviously then that's a low-risk situation where people start doing stuff. But it does introduce a problem, because the measures that I want to take will influence the profitability of the financier and will also provide challenges to the person who has the long-term use cycle to take care of. So this is the classic dilemma. And I apologize for the fact it's a very basic slide, but I had like 30 minutes to make it in the run-up to this conference. What you see is basically the standard dilemma. If I look at, say, an office building and I take a 20-year period, then I see, in this case, I take the elevator as something to look at as a case amongst the other cases. So we have two types of elevators. The one is rather cheap and the other one is rather expensive. So for the elevator A, which is the expensive one, I have a very strong incentive not to buy that if I'm a financier of a building, because I want to make something that functions perfectly on day one when I say, this is now your building, now take care of it for the next 30 to 40 years. But over the course of time, the so-called less expensive elevator actually has a much higher total cost of use, because it is of lesser quality, it requires more maintenance, it requires a major overhaul after 14 years, etc., etc., etc. And at the end of the day, you have costs of getting it out of your building, whereas the well-designed, more circular elevator actually returns some of its investment in residual value. But that split incentive is there. So how do we solve that? Because that's one thing you will always run into. I cannot do something today which is more expensive just because I will get a return on investment for that 20 or 30 years from now. So it takes courage also to let go of that sort of thinking. And publicly owned companies, they're based on their quarterly figures. They're not based on their moral or ethical background. They're just judged on, have you made more profit this quarter than you did the last one last year? So we need accountancy, Ernst & Young, KPMG, companies like that, to understand that we have a different approach which is necessary. So moving to a product service system is great, but then you're usually faced with the fact that someone needs to pay for the initial investment of creating something. And if there's no money to add just a service program, a producer will have a loss-giving problem for the first few years of their existence. And so maybe we should look at deferred ownership. Maybe have more of not so much of a hard cutoff between, say, what a financier puts in and when it gets sold to the long-term investor. Because everything ultimately hinges on the quality of the data. How well can I imagine something to be worth some number in euros 20 years from now? How do I get uncertainty out of this equation? Because a high reliability of figures means a low risk perception, which means an increased willingness to use new financing and exploitation models. These are very small letters, but I think that still works. So you need integrated data management on all of this. Because each product must be coupled with a material passport within a building, ideally within a building information model. So we know exactly what is in that building, where it is, who owns it, what is the status of it, when will it become available for secondary use, all those things. This passport must, however, therefore interface with both supply chains at the front end to feed it, with identifiers that are immutable, that identify something as being a door or a staircase, and this information needs to be lossless in its transformation into the Madaster-like system that you can have like that. Madaster, by the way, is a Dutch invention that is like we have a cadaster, which is an overview of every building and who owns it in our country. We now add to that a new layer of what's in that building, how much copper, how much concrete, how much steel, etc. It's a material-based system, and we're moving that up to making it a functional value-based system. And there we need every product, not just houses and office buildings, but also refrigerators, this computer, this microphone. We need to understand what's in there and what is there that can be retrieved for future use, and create that value and build it into the exploitation model. So I don't own a microphone, but I'm able to use the functionality of it. Because asset management is value management. So, I'll take the example, I just showed you the elevators. Well, we cracked that one with KPMG and Mitsubishi elevators. What we basically did is to say, okay, we have the split incentive, your elevator is more expensive, let's do something. We define the KPIs, the key performance indicators of the elevator. What does the elevator need to do now? And what will it need continuously to do over the course of time, over the next 20 years? What we then did is we benchmarked the purchasing price of every single elevator out there in the market, which would do that on day one. The lowest of those prices was our benchmark. And we said to all elevator providers, I said, well, this is what you get if you offer us a service program. You don't need to sell us an elevator. We'll give you an initial fee of the amount that the cheapest elevator on the market would actually set us back. Now, I want you to make us an offer on how we would pay on a monthly or a yearly basis on having use of the elevator. So defer ownership to the producer. The initial CE lease fee was the benchmark purchasing price. We extend write-off from us having to write it off in 20 years to the elevator company being able to write it off in 30 years if they wish to, because it will still be at least 80% or 90% of its original value by the time the lease project ends, because we will keep it at the KPIs during the course of its use cycle. And now all of a sudden the most sustainable option becomes the least expensive one. Because this is the new picture. With a flat fee, the producer actually gets the same total cost of use or their earning power established over the course of 20 years, but they're offering it at a much lower rate than the elevator producer who has to sell us the worst product. So they all make the same money, so it costs the developing financier the exact same amount of money, but the benefit now goes to the user and the owner of the long-term lease construct. And the other thing is, because you add, something is not continuing here. I appear to have lost control of my computer. There we go. Yeah, it's just a tad slow. Because the value of the asset is actually superimposed on its earning power, the actual return on investment of the elevator is roughly 25% higher for, in this case, Mitsubishi, than if they would have sold it to us. While we pay roughly 24% less. And the users and the investors, the long-term investors, actually save 300,000 euros over the course of 20 years. So everybody wins. And what pays for that? The fact that because we cannot yet use residual value as an uncertainty in our calculations, but we can extend internal write-off from 20 to 30 years, meaning that the elevator still adds 33% of its original value at the end of the lease period, making for a better statement. Now, it's really dependent on how your accountancy will judge the value of your company and its earning power and the potential earning power that having an asset represents. And in this case, everyone agreed, and it was done, and we have a simple system that now works today, doesn't rely on the uncertainty of residual value, but still takes the basic principles into account. Now imagine if we start actually using true residual value in models like this, then there's no way any linear model could ever compete with a circular model. Because if there is no residual value, I mean, you're starting your football game with 2 against 1 before you even started it. But the key factor in all of this is that you make that residual value count on day one. Don't rely on something to become available 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, or 140 years from now, because that's just not feasible in human timescales. So you get, the benefits are obviously you get lower founding costs, you get less reservations, because if you build something circular, your renovations will be later, they will be less costly because you've built things to be easily taken apart and reassembled. It's not like IKEA, where you buy something, you put it together, you actually never take it apart again, although they claim you should, but no one ever does. But you can with the building. So you need less materials, logistics, less unnecessary labor, less downtime, and less failure costs. These are all benefits that count on day one. Oh yeah, and I almost forgot, you also save our technologically advanced society from catastrophic system collapse, which I think rather nice. Yeah. So, 3 more things to round matters off. Re-evaluation. Reassess the value of your currently written off or undervalued assets. We look at our existing built environment, which is like 99% of all buildings, and we consider that to be, just there. But it's also 99% of all our building materials. And if we look at them not as something that needs to be demolished at some stage and therefore costs money, but if you actually look, so what functional value is actually in there, you'll be astounded and astonished at the amount of value which is in your current assets. And if you transfer that value into your future assets, it's one way of actually closing the loop quicker, because you're getting your residual value today, which is not a bad thing. Then there's, how do we make sure that if we have all that data on what is where, who owns it, when it becomes available, how can this data become immutable? Well, blockchain or something like blockchain is one of the things that you can envision having access to data regardless of there being a company that has a server that owns the information. Having stuff available through an open access system is actually quite important. And you can have open access to whichever level you require. It allows for distributed storage, and it means that your information is actually safeguarded against loss, which is again adding a level of certainty, which lowers your level of risk perception. Track and trace becomes easily understandable if you get all this system in your head, because you have to know which value is represented by what, where is it within the system, when will it become available for reuse, and who owns it. So who do I need to talk to if I want to get those 15 beautiful windows out of that building that they're going to demolish 2 years from now? That's the stuff we're looking at. So rounding it off with a case, because I think it's, I have 5 minutes left if I'm not mistaken. Thank you, yeah. I talk too much, right? Yeah. So this is that Park 2020 thing that we're going on about, which is basically the world's first and most complete cradle-to-cradle full-service business park, and the most relevant collection of cradle-to-cradle materials still. And we started construction in 2010, so that's bad news. We should have been overtaken left, right, and center by now, and that's not the case. So we're moving way too slow. It just looks like office buildings. There's nothing special about it. It doesn't look like it's been made out of secondary materials or that it will one day become secondary materials. But it's what you do not see which makes this an important evaluation and an important product. Because through the use of collaborative design, of not having people compete with each other on the lowest price, but asking people for a set price that offers the highest quality, and do this whilst working together with other parties in the supply chain, we lowered our failure costs, which in the Netherlands are roughly 24-25%, to roughly 7-8%, which means you have 13% at least of value to play with during the construction process alone. We did all the building information modeling and tried to couple it with passports. As far as they were available, we included the service systems. So the tiles you see on the facade to the bottom left, they're not owned by anyone else but the tile producer, and they simply charge us for using the tiles. Because the whole idea of cascading value is also important to us. We want to have maximal functional value retainment in every model that we, or every design that was put up. Now, this circular tendering and purchasing is important because collaborative bidding outperforms competitive bidding because people stop racing to the bottom with each other. If you ask for the highest quality for a fixed budget, and you do not ask for the lowest price for a stated specification, you will not have people just offering you something which barely meets your expectations but doesn't meet any others. If you ask people to say, what's the best you can do for this price, you'll be competing on quality rather than trying to outperform each other on a price level. And the end result is that you actually pay less if you keep your fixed budget than if you would try and get the lowest price and then find out you have to pay a lot more on refurbishings and other stuff over the course of the use cycle. So to make this even more apparent, we made a comparison of two buildings across the road from each other. One was built in 2015 in Park 2020. The other was built in 2014 across the road, not adhering to the cradle-to-cradle principles or the circularity principles, if you will. So we came up with a comparison, and this is interesting because this basically says it. How do we look at the financial balance of that building? And then you see that the rental value actually goes up in the case of a cradle-to-cradle inspired building because you have a higher quality and you get a different set of customers, obviously, that wishes to work and live there. Annual cost to the investor is slightly less because you pay less on maintenance and stuff. The residual value of the core and shell goes from a negative 686,000 euros to 1.3 million in the plus. Your construction costs are indeed higher for the cradle-to-cradle building, but your actual net present value exploitation result is 6 million in the plus. So that's quite a difference. This is this is based on a 30-year lease, but that value is real, and you can look at it and you can actually measure it. Even on our current conditions, we can state what the benefits of circular construction are, and you can use that for the entire financing of the project. So it starts making sense from day one. So basically, as I was saying earlier, if you understand that thinking in sustainability measures in a classical way of being less bad, being more efficient, that's costing you money. Circularity actually makes you money. And although I'm not keen on money myself, I think we would be better off in a moneyless society. But I also know that's utopia, or Blautopia if you wish. So we have to deal with the system we're in, which says profitability will always outcompete loss-givingness. So circularity makes you money. I suggest we do that and build our future. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Olaf. Whoa, there was so much information that I think we need to digest that for many days. But let's have comments, questions, remarks. And what I would like to ask now is that let's try to share information. So please do tweet, and please write your remarks also to that Slido and ask questions. So I will just take a look if there's any, and Olaf, I'll get back to you in a minute. So the one question to you, Olaf, through the Slido is the next comment actually. If circular economy increases value, improves design, and does still not profit growth, why aren't everyone doing it already?
That's a great question. I don't understand at all.
Where to break the cycle?
Well, we are creatures of habit, and because we are all driven by scarcity from our biological standpoint, because we used to be tribes that roamed the land, and when the food was gone, we moved somewhere else. And only when we started to invent agriculture did we actually stay in one place. So we're wired to take care of scarcity. We don't think in abundance terms. That's not our nature. And I think that's actually part of the problem. It's really our biology that is hindering us from doing things in a better way. But the real thing is that because we've experienced like 30 to 40 years now of real sustainability laws and legislation, and everything is telling us that if we want to improve things, we need to spend more money, and that's it. We haven't really gotten to the idea yet that we can spend money on improving the value of something, whilst at the same time reducing its negative effects. It's just, we are slow in adapting. And although it works on paper, and I show everyone, I say, well, we can do that today. I mean, I make a living as a consultant to try and move people out from the old way of doing things into the new way, and they always earn more than they pay me, which is a good thing. Otherwise, I should be out of business. It's always about adding value, and that's just, we're not wired that way, so we need to force ourselves. But in this case, the system will force the change because we're now running into geopolitical scarcity. I mean, there's not enough rare earth metals to build like wind turbines or photovoltaic cells or lithium for cars. So we need to do something else, and we cannot go back to fossil. So yeah.
All right, really good. And by the way, did you pay attention, dear audience, that you, Olaf, actually emphasized the similar sort of things what the minister also emphasized in her presentation, meaning the role of good design, for example, and to have a holistic or system view and thinking. For example, Harry, do we have a question? So please.
So my name is Ying Zhu from Rumble. We are a design company. But my question is to you. You show this financial calculation after the building has been built. My question is that have you compared the time of building in the new way versus the conditional?
Oh yeah. I mean, you actually make your deadlines because you have less problems in the construction phase. Some things take a little longer, like it takes longer to screw a metal bar in than it takes to weld it. But at the same time, because of the less clashes during construction, means less overtime in the construction process. So the actual time it takes to put up the building decreases significantly.
Yeah. So that's a point that worth presenting, because I think most of the construction companies are built in a project-based.
Yeah.
And the time is a very important consideration.
Absolutely.
For that.
Yeah.
Okay, what I would like to encourage us here in this conference room now is that we are next having a break for 15 minutes, and during that break, please come to talk to Olaf, share ideas, introduce yourself, and learn more and have a discussion. About your key points.
I mean, if there's any place on earth where design is key, it's in Northern Europe, here in Scandinavia. I mean, you probably have the best designers outside of the Netherlands. No, that's a joke. You probably have some of the best designers on earth, and especially Finland being probably one of the most tech-savvy countries on earth as well. I mean, if there's any place where this could really take off, it's over here. So, I mean, that's...
thank you.
No,
perfect.
You're so good at this. So, I mean, show it to the world. It's important.
So thank you very much. We will.